Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews. I'm joined by Arthur Grimes, who's Senior Fellow at Motu Research and Professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University. Welcome, Arthur. Thanks for your time.
Hi, Gareth. Good to see you.
Yeah, we're going to talk about, obviously, the only story that's around at the moment, which is COVID-19 or coronavirus, whichever you prefer.
Yep.
And you're obviously a vastly experienced economist. A good place to start would be asking you, how big of an impact do you think this is going to have on the New Zealand economy, and how do you put this in a historical context? Where does it rank, do you think?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago I was asked that in a business audience, and I said it was the biggest shock to New Zealand's economy since the Great Depression. And I think that's still accurate. The only question now is whether it's bigger than the Great Depression, at least in a short-term sense. It's much bigger than the global financial crisis, much bigger than the Asian financial crisis, and it's bigger than the two oil shocks of the 70s put together, I think. And they were huge. They were immense. And then there was nothing really as big as that until we go back to the 30s. I think the difference between this one and the 30s, though, is that I expect this one to be much more short-lived. I'm moderately optimistic that we and the world economy will pull out of this much faster than we did out of the Great Depression, but the short-term downward effect is probably at least as large as the initial impetus of the Great Depression.
It's interesting that you're optimistic that it will be short-lived, at least compared to the Great Depression. What gives you confidence on that?
Well, I think I'm optimistic on that either retrovirals will come through, so to treat the disease, or else vaccines. And that may take a year or whatever. But that's once those are in place, and I don't see any major impediment to the world economy rebounding sharply at that stage. In the interim, I'm lucky that we're a commodity producing country and people still want to buy food. We went into this downturn with an extraordinarily strong fiscal debt situation, public debt situation, so we've got a lot of leeway to cushion ourselves through it. So even at the end, in a year or two's time, our public debt situation won't be disastrous. And so it's not like we'll have to go into a prolonged period of, tightness, fiscal tightness or anything like that, because, our public debt will be at quite a reasonable level compared with our history and compared with other countries.
That's quite a good, rosy picture of New Zealand, but I guess we are, as you noted, we're an exporting nation. Some of our key partners overseas are looking pretty bad. So how big of a concern is it to New Zealand what happens in other countries?
Oh, well, it's very important to us, clearly. We exports are a reasonable proportion of our economy. We're not a particularly large exporter compared with many other countries, but, it's still quite large. And I think we have to realise that tourism exports are going to be down the drain for a couple of years. But the rest of our export sector, I think, will be pretty strong. And, we're lucky that we have China as our biggest market. They've done very well through this. And, we're quite diversified as well in terms of our exports. So they go to many different places. So even if one area is not doing too well, at least other areas will. So, we're dependent on the rest of the world, but don't see any reason why the rest of the world won't pick up also in the space of 1 to 2 years.
In terms of the responses to drive this recovery that you're talking about, do you see, I guess, what the government's done to date? We're talking about major fiscal stimulus. We've got the Reserve Bank. We've got quantitative easing in New Zealand, which is still, I pinch myself occasionally to think that's happening, but it certainly is. Are these the only types of responses we're going to need, or are we going to need some more, perhaps even more unorthodox ones as well?
Yeah, I think the responses to date have been really good, both from the fiscal side and the monetary side. I think, and again, it's because we went into the situation so strongly. to begin with. We've got plenty of room to maneuver. I think more will be required. You know, businesses are going to be losing a lot of their equity. Many have lost all their equity in the short term. And so I think there's going to have to be some form of essentially the replication of business interruption insurance. You know, that product's been offered for a long time, but not many businesses take it out. And a colleague of mine, old colleague of mine in the UK, Alistair Milne, has suggested that we can model government responses by putting them on business interruption insurance. What would that pay? And that would pay not just for wages, but it would pay for rent and things like that as well. I think that that's something that we should look at, refining the way that we are intervening to think about, well, how would a business interruption insurance product be used now? And maybe after the fact, once we've got the rescue, maybe put an ex post premium on businesses to pay for that insurance that it didn't pay for in the first place.
In terms of how, I guess, the economy looks the other side of COVID-19, I mean, how different do you think things will be? And do you think, I mean, it's interesting, you talked about, obviously, one of our strengths at the moment is that we're a food exporter, and obviously people, whatever's going on, they still need to eat. So that's a good thing to be. We've had a lot of debate in this country in recent years, I guess, about the environmental impact of some of our food production. What does that mean going forward? Because it does seem that, obviously food production is going to be a bigger driver, economic driver for us than tourism for some time. Migration's been a big driver for us. That's possibly going to be hit, although there may be some expat Kiwis who will be wanting to come home after this. And what about things like superannuation? Will we still be able to afford that?
Well, migration is a choice for us. I mean, there's still going to be tens or hundreds of thousands of people wanting to move to New Zealand, perhaps even more so than they ever have. So I think that's a choice, whether we want migration or not. That's not going to dry up unless we choose it to dry up. Now, obviously, in the short term, it'll dry up because of the restrictions on overseas travel. But longer term, that's a choice that we can easily, include again. One of my concerns, actually, at a social level, is I see a growing sense of xenophobia in New Zealand, where people are, suddenly saying, "Well, do we want these tourists? Do we want these migrants, etc.?" It's quite a xenophobic attitude, in my view. I've always been very partial to having a diverse group of tourists and a diverse group of migrants coming to New Zealand. I think it's great to sort of stop New Zealand being so dull as it used to be. So I think that's a choice that we can go back to if we wish it to, if the xenophobia doesn't take over. So my main fear actually on that front is that we will become more xenophobic, and that will be very counterproductive, I think, for New Zealand. If we don't go down that route and we stay nice and open, as I hope we will be, I think we've got great prospects going forward. I don't see major issues most of our export structures, but I do think, it's the point that Rod Carr has made from the Climate Change Commission, we do need to think about the recovery in a climate change positive sort of way. So I don't think we can stop our path towards net zero carbon emissions. That should continue, and that should continue on our existing big emitters, which includes agriculture.
So that could pose some challenges, though, I guess, if agriculture becomes an even bigger part of our exporting.
Well, it won't become a bigger part. It might become a bigger share, but it won't actually grow in size necessarily. But I think we do need to start, or at least not stop the route of going down to starting to price agricultural emissions along with all other carbon emissions.
One of the other things, I guess, going to your point about concern about xenophobia, we've obviously seen in recent years, we've seen, I guess, challenges to globalization. And I'm thinking primarily there, obviously, with President Trump's America First focus. We've seen Brexit in the UK, and we've seen some growth of, I guess, populists, if you want to call them that, in various countries around the world. This pandemic is potentially quite a hit to globalization, isn't it? So is that a concern of yours? Do you think that's a particularly bad thing for New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, there is a danger if the rest of the world sort of leverages that feeling. And if you think about the Great Depression, it was one of the big reasons why the Great Depression lasted so long was because of the xenophobia that happened at the time in terms of people, putting in place trade barriers, etc., across many countries in the world. So I just hope that that doesn't happen again. I hope we've learned from history in that way. But as you say, many of the world leaders are pretty xenophobic these days, and that is a concern. And that would be for me, that would be the major concern for the world economy, that countries become insular, and that we drop the globalization agenda. The globalization agenda has been an extraordinary benefit to billions of people throughout the world, and to go back on that agenda, I think, would be extremely counterproductive, and especially for the poor, benefited hugely from it.
Given there's not much going on in the way of global leadership against this pandemic, it's almost a case of every country for themselves at the moment. How do you think a small trading nation like New Zealand can actually do that? Who should we be working with, and how?
Well, I guess one of the nice things about being small is no one takes much notice of you, so you can actually just work behind the scenes and not create a fuss. And our diplomats have always been very good at that, and we can work with multiple parties. So I think that's an advantage for us.
Okay, and just I guess looking ahead, then you'd be anticipating further stimulus from the government. Are there any things the government and the Reserve Bank haven't done yet that you would expect they will do?
Well, I think there will be some more business support packages, certainly. So not so much on the wage side, but on just making sure that businesses stay afloat. And I think there's going to be more needed to be done on that front. And actually, the thing that worries me most about our economy moving forward, other than the sort of attitudes, is many of our firms are going to be capital constrained coming out of this situation. I mean, they would have much of their capital, their cash flows have been down or non-existent. And investment normally requires capital to back it. So people are going to want to have good balance sheets before they start investing. So it's quite possible that government may have to think about some mechanisms to support capital investment as we come out of the recession, to make sure that firms have got enough capital or some other form of backing to be able to go ahead with capital projects. And if they can't do it, the government's going to have to do it through infrastructure and housing development.
Housing's an interesting one, and that's an area that you've focused on quite a bit in the past. What impact do you think this is going to have on housing?
Potentially twofold. One is that I think house prices will drop. I think they could drop quite sharply. I haven't seen much evidence of that happening yet, but I think there is quite a potential for house prices to drop very sharply. Don't have new migrants coming in. I think that would be a good thing socially. It would be a very good thing. And second is this actually provides the opportunity for to really ramp up Kiwi Build. Kiwi Build never made much sense when we had fully employed resources, but it makes a lot of sense when we don't have fully employed resources. So once we can get the construction industry going again, whether that's level 3 or level 2, I think there's a huge opportunity for Kiwi Build to come into its own.
That's interesting. So COVID-19 could be a lifeline for the beleaguered Kiwi Build.
Absolutely. It was just the shot in the arm that Kiwi Build needed.
Very interesting. And just finally, it does look like that we are heading into an era of big government through necessity, really, given how significant this economic crisis is. Do you think that means things like tax cuts, for example, are going to be off the political agenda?
Oh, I don't think there's any way we could have tax cuts. None at all. I mean, I think we could have tax rises. And we're going to have to pay for something in the end. I would be astonished to see tax cuts in this situation.
In terms of tax rises, do you have any particular areas in mind where you think the government might look to increase its tax take?
Well, I mean, I've got no idea of what the government's thinking on this. I'm sure they wouldn't increase GST. They were very clear in the tax working group that they didn't want novel taxes like land taxes, etc. As much as I favour that, I would expect to see an increase in the top tax rate, income tax rate. I think we're going to have to pay for the fiscal expansion in some way, and that'll be essentially the only way they'll be able to afford it.
Okay, well, look, thanks a lot for that, Arthur. That's Arthur Grimes, who is a Senior Fellow at Motu Research and a Professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.